today, Steve Witkoff was on his own in Russia, and he. I mean, let's not assume he's acting in bad faith, but he's just not a skilled diplomatic negotiator. Whereas the Russians are Lavrov, Putin, and from them on down, they have a lot of expertise there, and I think that alone puts the Americans in a weaker position.
We're being told the U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and the Russian President Vladimir Putin had constructive talks in Moscow today, and that's according to an aide of Putin's. Yuri Ushakov said the possibility of Russia and Ukraine resuming direct talks was a particular point of discussion. The US has not released details of what was discussed during the meeting, but afterwards, President Trump said work to bring about a peace deal between the two sides was going smoothly. It comes as the Times reports tonight that Trump's plan to let Russia keep occupied territory in Ukraine is set in stone as pressure builds on President Zelensky to accept a forced peace. Well, let's go to Elisabeth Braw, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Centre for Strategy and Security. Welcome back to the programme, Elisabeth. Elisabeth.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi. Trump said today that he wants to get a deal as possible. What do you make of the signs, what we're hearing, what you feel? What are your sources telling you?
Well, what is abundantly clear is that Trump is very keen on this deal that the Americans have put together, and that the Americans' talks with the Russians seem to be going well, as in Steve Witkoff representing the Americans. But the unavoidable fact is that the deal would have to involve Ukraine. And so if you conduct peace talks in two directions, with the Americans talking with the Russians on one hand, and then putting pressure on the Ukrainians, it's a duplicated effort. What would need to happen for this deal to be properly negotiated is that Russians and Ukrainians would have to negotiate it themselves. And so we risk ending up with a deal that the Americans and the Russians and the Ukrainians say, well, it's just not possible for us to agree to that deal. I think we're about to reach that point.
Well, if you look at the Times report for Saturday, the headline "Land Deal is the only choice." The US proposal was presented by Witkoff to Moscow and Kyiv. And so apart from the formal US recognition of Russia's control over Crimea and the de facto recognition of Russia's control over southern and eastern Ukraine, we've also got the prospect of the United States withdrawing funding for munitions and leaving the Ukraine dependent on the Europeans, who don't seem able to step into the breach. Where do you think that leaves President Zelensky?
It leaves him in a very precarious position. Ukraine has a lot of moral support, financial support, and military support from European countries, including the UK, but clearly not enough to immediately make up for what they have been receiving from the Americans. And I think the challenge for Ukraine here is that Steve Witkoff is just not an experienced diplomatic negotiator. He may have goodwill. Let's assume that he approaches it with goodwill, but conducting diplomatic talks, is not like conducting business talks. And
yes, let me interrupt you there for a second, Elisabeth. I mean, you saw the pictures of Putin smiling at Witkoff. I mean, you saw him with arms outstretched. I mean, he didn't embrace him, but his arms were initially outstretched. And then you saw Witkoff sitting down on his own, apart from one translator on one side of the table. And then Putin and three other senior officials and, negotiators on the other side. I mean, what does that tell you about how this series of negotiations has been conducted?
It tells me that the Americans need a bit more support from skilled negotiators, diplomatic negotiators. Now, Trump did float very briefly yesterday what I thought was a good idea when the Prime Minister of Norway was visiting Washington, and Trump mentioned that Norway could help. Norway has the world's best diplomatic negotiators. They are so skilled in solving international crises, including, by the way, Israel-Palestine back a number of years ago. They could play a crucial role in this. But as you say, today Steve Witkoff was on his own in Russia, and he. I mean, let's not assume he's acting in bad faith, but he's just not a skilled diplomatic negotiator. Whereas the Russians are Lavrov, Putin, and from them on down, they have a lot of expertise there, and I think that alone puts the Americans in a weaker position.
It does indeed. Briefly on this final one, Elisabeth, we heard the mayor of Kyiv, Vitali Klitschko, admitting that Ukraine may have to cede land for peace, and then we heard the president's insisting he's not going to agree to Trump's demands on Crimea and other occupied land. I mean, how significant do you think this split is, and do you think we're going to see more of it?
There has been rivalry between Klitschko and Zelensky for a long time. So the fact that Klitschko voices a different opinion, I don't think we should read too much into it.
Okay.
But there will be disagreement, as there is in any democracy. But crucial issues like this, and it is unfortunate that Ukraine has been put in a position where it has to make a choice on whether to accept a really unfortunate deal or fight on without the support that it deserves.
Sure. Elisabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Centre for Strategy and Security. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio.
Any questions?
What do you hope Steve Witkoff will get out of his meeting with Putin today?
He'll be calling me. They just left the meeting. I haven't been briefed yet, but he had, I hear, a pretty good meeting.
Has the President any update on Secretary Nixon?
How are you, Mr. President?
Fine, just fine, thank you.
How are you? So good to see you.
From the embassy. Okay.
U.S. President Donald Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, and Russian President Vladimir Putin met in Moscow on Friday to discuss the U.S. plan to end the war in Ukraine, with the Kremlin describing the 3-hour meeting as constructive and very useful. Witkoff's latest trip follows talks this week at which Ukrainian and European officials pushed back against some of the U.S. proposals for how to settle the conflict, the deadliest in Europe since World War II. But Trump told reporters on Friday that he believed a peace deal was close.
We're going to try and get out of war so that we can save 5,000 people a week, and that's what my aim is. I want to save 5,000 young men. They happen to be mostly Ukrainian, Russian. That's a big honor if I can do it. I think we're pretty close.
Witkoff's visit comes a day after Trump criticized a Russian missile and drone attack on Kyiv that killed at least 12 people and posted on social media, quote, "Vladimir, stop." On Friday, Kyiv residents brought flowers to a makeshift memorial at the site of the Russian strike. Meanwhile, Russian investigators said a car bomb killed a senior Russian military officer in the town of Balashiha just east of Moscow, in an attack that Russian war bloggers blamed on Ukraine. The killing followed the assassinations of several high-ranking Russian military figures, which Moscow has blamed on Kyiv. Russia and Ukraine have not held direct talks since the early weeks of the war, which started in February 2022. According to text seen by Reuters, the peace proposal Witkoff has presented calls for formal U.S. recognition of Russia's control over Crimea, the Ukrainian peninsula Moscow seized and annexed in 2014. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said this week that recognizing Crimea as part of Russia would violate Ukraine's constitution.